sponsoring. This is the first of our invited lecture series, and our hope is to create a series where we're going to have popular topics in youth development and bring in the national and international experts and leading edge research and have them come and talk to us in language that we can all understand. This could be demonstrated today. We're going to talk on autism treatments by Dr. Deal. And I do have the honor of introducing Dr. Deal from the University of Notre Dame.
I can't hear you back here.
You got it.
Thank you.
Dr. Deal received his undergraduate degree in psychology and linguistics at Princeton University, where he was distinguished as the only self-admitted NASCAR fan that has ever been in the halls of Princeton. He received his PhD in clinical psychology at University of Rochester and completed a postdoc fellowship in neurodevelopmental disorders at Yale University. He has received a number of awards for his research, teaching, and clinical work, and is published in a variety of journals spanning in different fields, including psychology, speech-language pathology, linguistics, and robotics. Dr. Deal's research focuses on understanding and improving social communication in individuals with autism spectrum disorders. Among his many fruitful lines of research, the topic of his talk today will be on his work with the integration of interactive humanoid robots and social skills interventions for children with autism spectrum disorders. So I'd like to pass this over and welcome Dr. Deal to Marion campus.
Hello, everybody. So I'd like to make one addition to what Dr. Davis was saying. Not only was I the only NASCAR fan, but I started the NASCAR club at Princeton, which had one member. Sometimes I had two if I was dating somebody who was humoring me, but I wasn't dating much in college. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about treatments. And I want to start out talking broadly about what I mean when I talk about autism spectrum disorder. And hopefully you'll see when I say autism spectrum disorder that I'm actually saying something different than what Dr. Data said. Dr. Data said autism spectrum disorders, but there's a movement away from that towards one unifying diagnosis, so hopefully that will make sense. But then we'll talk about treatments, and I'll sprinkle in a little bit of our own research at the end. So hopefully, if at any point as I'm talking about these, if you have questions, please ask, because I made this flexible so that we can have a back and forth conversation. I will also be looking for a couple of volunteers at different points. So if you don't want to volunteer, make sure that you hide, because I like to pick on people. So now whenever you give one of these talks, you always have to give acknowledgments to show that you don't have any biases, who's funding you, who's paying for your research. So I have a list of some of the people that have funded our research, and specifically our robotics research. But the one thing I want to highlight is I do have an inherent bias in here that I'm funded by the Arby's Foundation. I have to say that Arby's sandwiches are delicious. You should buy them. That's a bias I have to get out there. However, I will say that I know that one of my favorite restaurants, White Castle, is very close, and I've had some wonderful experiences in Columbus with those delicious White Castle sandwiches. So I'm just saying that I also love White Castle as well. So, again, today what we're going to start off, I have a picture by Stephen Wiltshire. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he's an artist with autism that has amazing cityscape drawings. But we're going to talk about definition, move on to diagnosis and treatments, and then end with some of our own research. So, I want to make sure that we're on the same page here. And the first thing I want to say is that I've made it sort of my personal mission to spread knowledge about autism. There's been a huge push in the last decade for autism awareness. But there's been a problem that's arisen out of this, is that there's been awareness without knowledge. I think everybody knows autism exists. I think most people know that the number of diagnosed cases are increasing. And that can be really scary, that can be really frightening. And what I want to do is talk about what autism actually is, and maybe that will help us understand the condition in addition to just knowing that it exists. Now, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's interesting. It's not unique. It's interesting in that it's defined by behavior and diagnosed by behavior. Now, this is important because a diagnosis like Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome, those are defined by a cause. They're defined by something medical, usually genetic, that can be tested. There's a clear test. So you know if somebody has Down syndrome or they don't have Down syndrome. You know if somebody has Fragile X syndrome or they don't have Fragile X syndrome. That's not autism. Autism is defined by a set of behaviors that we believe occur together, that represent a population of individuals that struggle with certain types of behaviors and social interactions. Now, there's no medical test to say whether or not somebody has autism. Essentially, it involves observation and interaction with the child, but also report from parents. So it's not clear-cut, meaning you have autism or you don't have autism. So it's different than some of the other developmental disabilities that you might be familiar with. A little bit closer to ADHD. ADHD is the same way in that it's defined by a set of behaviors, a way of perceiving the world that characterizes the diagnosis. Now, this is really important, and I think that this is going to be relevant for the rest of this conversation, in that because autism is a diagnosis that's defined by behavior, successful treatments tend to focus on changing behavior, altering behavior, working specifically on behaviors, individually targeting the behaviors that each individual child struggles with. So again, I want to think about autism not in terms of some sort of categorical diagnosis with a cause, but as a disorder that's diagnosed based on these behaviors. Now, our current diagnosis, basically autism is represented by deficits in social interaction and communication. That's something that all individuals on the autism spectrum struggle with. So it could be something as profound as actually not engaging with somebody in a social interaction. But it also could be somebody who really, really wants to engage in social interactions but doesn't understand how to interact. So within the autism spectrum, it can include this wide variety of different types of behaviors. And I like to talk of it in terms of a spectrum of abilities, but also needs for support. So there are areas that individuals with autism individually can have relative strengths, can be better than you or I would be in certain tasks, certain ways of perceiving and thinking about things, but also have specific challenges in terms of socially interacting with others. And they might also have certain types of behaviors or interests that might interfere with their ability to complete schoolwork or to engage with other people, participate in recreational activities. So for example, there was one child that I worked with who was very verbal, very intelligent, and but had trouble interacting with other people, had this really, really intense interest in birds. Carried around his bird book with him that was about this thick, knew everything in the world about birds. And as soon as you introduced yourself to him, he would start talking to you about birds, asking if you're interested in birds or whatever. Actually, made his parents rename their house Bird HQ, or Bird Headquarters.
Nice.
But the problem is that he could only interact over that certain topic and had trouble interacting with others about their interests or other topics. So you can see from the child that is barely able to speak all the way up to the child that has these very specific interests, that we're not talking about developing some sort of treatment that's going to help all children with autism. We have to think about this individually. We have to think about what sort of approaches are going to work best for which individuals. Now, I wanted to give you another example of how autism can vary across the spectrum. So we know, again, 40% of individuals with ASD lack any sort of communication. Now, some children with autism can use language, but they have a lot of delays in language. And then there are other children that are very, very verbal that have subtle things that stick out about the way they communicate. Now, there's language, there's the words that we use, and then there's using those words, right? There's how you say things, what you say, when you say them, to whom you say them, what's appropriate about how you use them. And for a number of individuals with autism, there can be these subtle differences in things like using gestures to communicate, understanding and using facial expressions. Or even something as subtle as tone of voice, for example. And I want to give you an example here from one of our studies where we were looking at differences in how children with autism use tone of voice to communicate. Now, if you hear me when I'm talking right now, there's sort of a pattern, a rhythm, a beat to what I'm saying. And what I have is an example here of a child without a diagnosis saying a narrative. And what I've done is I've eliminated all the B's and the T's and the Q's and anything that has some sort of beat to it, so you can just hear the tone of voice, so you can get an idea of what the rhythm sounds like, because it's hard to pay attention to that without getting rid of the other stuff. So you hear that pattern, there's almost a melody to this individual when they're speaking. Now I want to give you an example of a boy with autism, the same age, telling the same story to somebody else, and you can hear the pronounced difference. This is somebody who can use words and is very verbal, has a really high vocabulary, but has these subtle differences. So this is an example of what would be considered monotone speech. Again, somebody that maybe when you first start interacting with them, you realize that they're very verbal, but you think they might sound awkward or might sound different. And this individual just doesn't understand or use things like tone of voice or facial expressions the way that you or I would. Now here's the other challenge about autism, and I'm giving this example to highlight the challenge of what we're talking about when we talk about treatment. I have another example, a different boy, same age, telling the same story, who also has unusual prosody. But you'll be able to tell right away how that prosody is different. Very exaggerated. So not following any sort of beat or rhythm, but all over the place. More so than you would expect even for a child his age. And these deficits, I had to actually filter some of the other stuff out so you could know exactly what those differences are. So we have some children with profound difficulties, some children with very subtle difficulties. So the question is, how do we approach this in terms of treatment? There's not one good answer for this. Now, so far I've been using the term autism to represent autism spectrum disorder, which is the new diagnosis. Now, what's happening is that in a little bit, you might have heard some of these diagnoses: Asperger's syndrome, high-functioning autism, PDD, autism spectrum disorders, plural. All of these things get used and thrown around right now. In a year, all of these diagnoses are going to be eliminated, even autism. And there's going to be one diagnosis to represent all of these different diagnoses. Because the idea is there aren't categorical groups of individuals with autism. What you have is, because it's defined by behavior, it's sort of a broad, again, spectrum of abilities and needs for support. So all of these are going to be categorized as autism spectrum disorder. You may have read, there's some articles that have come out recently about concerns about, the loss of Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis, and there's some social implications that go along with that. But what I'm talking about today, I'm talking about autism spectrum disorder broadly as one diagnosis, because in a year, all of the rest of these diagnoses are going to disappear. So, even when I say autism or autism spectrum disorder, I'm referring to the entire autism spectrum. So when we talk about treatments, and we're talking about treating a disorder that's diagnosed based on behavior, there's another important differentiation to make. Now, there are a lot of organizations that are pushing to find a cure for autism. And this is looking for a cause or causes of autism. And over the past 10 or 15 years, we've realized that that's not as easy as it sounds. There are certain genes that might contribute to autism. There are certain things in the environment that may or may not contribute to autism, things in terms of pregnancy and labor and delivery. But what we learned is that there's no singular cause that's going to cause autism. So, even if we knew the cause, for example, we know the cause of Fragile X syndrome, we know the cause of Down syndrome, that doesn't necessarily translate into a cure for somebody who processes the world in a different way. So when I'm talking about treatments, I'm not talking about treatments that are going to cure autism. I'm talking about treatments that are going to focus on building skills and getting rid of behaviors that could be barriers to interacting with others, to participating in school. I'm not talking about curing autism. I'm talking about giving children with autism the skills and the supports necessary for them to navigate a world that can be confusing for them. So that's an important differentiation. In none of these approaches am I talking about a cure. Now, as I said, there's a considerable amount of research on the causes of autism. But unfortunately, in a lot of ways, we're using the same treatments that we were using 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And for the longest time, we thought if we focused on causes, we were going to find a cure. But what we're realizing now is that we have a lot of children that even if we understood some sort of genetic basis, they're still going to need treatment and support. So I'm pushing, and I hope you can leave here with the idea that we need to have more research on the most important research approaches, the best treatment approaches. Now, and this is one thing I'm going to say. Whenever I give a talk, whether I'm talking to students or parents or professionals, I always hear about a new breakthrough treatment that I haven't heard about before. And I read about autism every single day. I read in the news. I read research articles. I review research articles. And so just because I haven't heard of a treatment doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to work in the future. But what it's representative of is the fact that there has been an explosion of different approaches that don't have research support. And this has happened because we haven't been doing research on which treatments work best. So it's understandable that there are a lot of experimental approaches or complementary and alternative approaches because the parents that I know that work with children with autism, or work with their children, are going to do anything they can to help their children. My little brother was born with a developmental disability, and I know that my parents did everything they could to get the best treatment, and if the treatment wasn't available, they would try to figure something out for them. So it's more representative of the fact that we haven't done enough in terms of finding good treatments with empirical support. But what I'm going to do today is outline a couple of the approaches that we know about that do help, and then highlight some where there may or may not be research support for them. So again, no single treatment that helps all children with autism. There's no single treatment that helps with all of the symptoms of autism. Again, you're targeting symptoms or behaviors in autism, not autism itself. There are no treatments that are proven to help with everything all at once, even medications. And again, the best approach is going to involve multiple approaches, targeting different behaviors with different approaches, tailored to the individual with autism. Here's what we know. We know that treatment is expensive, it's time-consuming, and there's usually not enough of it available. We know that not many insurance companies cover it, even though some states have mandates for certain types of approaches, but most of the time it's actually not covered. Sometimes it will be covered through waivers, through state or federal programs, but a lot of the treatment that families get comes out of their own pocket. The schools, are strapped for money, can't always provide the amount of services that the families need as well. And now, if you're a family, your child has just received a diagnosis, and you go and do a search on treatment. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for me, and I really know a lot about the topic. Just doing a Google search, autism treatment, and you'll see 100 different approaches. You'll see cures, you'll see government sites, you'll see places trying to sell you things. It's overwhelming. And so how do you separate the good approaches from people who are just trying to take advantage of your desire to help your child as a parent. And so I'm going to outline, I'm going to go through these 4 different types of approaches. We're going to talk about psychological approaches. We're going to talk about educational approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about medication and a little bit about some complementary and alternative approaches and what we know about them. So when I talk about us using the same treatments that we used 10, 20, 30 years ago, I'm talking about the most common treatment approaches for autism right now. The most common treatment approach is something that's called applied behavior analysis therapy. This is more common in children with fewer verbal skills or children who are nonverbal, and it's been adapted for individuals who have more abilities, but it's primarily used for skill building. Now, if I could have, I just wanted to give a quick example of how something like this might look, and I need a volunteer. If I don't get an eager volunteer, I'm going to pick on somebody in the front row. You'll be a volunteer. Excellent. If I could have you sit here. And what we're going to do is we're going to work on things like making eye contact. So I want you to pretend at first like you're not making eye contact with me. Okay? So look at me. Look at me. Good looking at me. And so I would figure out something that would be reinforcing or rewarding to her. It might be a toy. In the past, they used things like food. I try to stay away from things like food because it's not good to feed kids lots and lots of Skittles, but some people do. But I find something that's rewarding for her. And I say, let's pretend you like holding the microphone. So, okay, look at me. Look at me. Look at me. And if she's not looking at me, I might prompt her. I might say, and I apologize, please don't see me. I might say, look at me, until I get her to the point where she makes eye contact. When she does make eye contact, I say, good job, good looking at me. And she gets to hold that. That's reinforcing for her. And then I take that away, and she might and we'll have some sort of behavior play for that. But we do that until she starts to realize the importance of eye contact. It's very time intensive, again, focusing on a very specific skill. It could be things like getting the child to sit in a seat. It could be stopping the child from biting their arm or hitting themselves. So we're talking about very basic skills that we're working on. If the child is more verbal, you might start working on something like responding to somebody's question. So if I say hello, and if she doesn't respond, then I might have a card and prompt her to have her say hello. And then I show you the card that says hello and you say hello. And so we work on that sort of response over and over again, repetitively, until you learn that a conversation, when somebody asks you a question or says something like that, that you're supposed to respond. Now, we all learn these things naturally. And when somebody asks you a question, like, how are you doing today, that you would respond. And then you would naturally follow that with an additional question. We know those things automatically. Children with autism don't necessarily always know those rules. So what you do is you break down these rules so that they can learn these rules. And this is part of this whole applied behavior analysis approach, is working skill by skill to build this sort of interaction. So thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. Now, I'm saying that this is a treatment that's been around for 20 or 30 years, has tons of empirical support for building different types of behaviors. There are whole classrooms that are built around this type of approach. Now, you can probably see already problems that go along with ABA. It's not a perfect approach. First of all, you have to find something that's going to be reinforcing or interesting for the child, other than food, because if you just keep feeding the kid food, the kid's going to get bigger and bigger. That's what happened to me when I started eating lots of food. I got bigger and bigger, and that's not necessarily healthy. So you want to try to find something that's intrinsically interesting, and ideally something that's going to be interesting in a social realm, not just something that's different from a social interaction, but something that could additionally encourage somebody to interact socially. Also, what we're doing is we're practicing the same thing over and over again. That doesn't necessarily translate into real-time interactions. So how do you take these very structured settings and get them to apply with conversations with friends at school? So it's hard to get those sorts of things to translate. Now, there was a response to ABA. And it's called the Greenspan technique. Some people call it DIR. There's a lot of different names for it, a lot of different versions of it now. But the idea, it was sort of the antithesis, the opposite of ABA. And what was happening was you essentially follow the child's lead. So if a child was sitting on the floor, you got down on the floor with that kid. If the child pushed a toy, you tried to interact with them over them pushing that toy. You engaged the child at their level. Now, this also took a very long time. You can imagine, because it's not as structured as ABA is, it's harder to prove that it's actually working. So there was not a lot of research support for it. But it was an alternative to ABA. In a lot of ways, some people saw it as a more human approach to option to ABA, because you're really interacting with the child. It was a lot more fun than just practicing things over and over again. Now, the cool thing is that even if this DIR approach hasn't had a lot of research support, what it's done is it's spawned a number of what I think of as sort of hybrid approaches that have the ABA model where you're building skills, but you build the skills in real environments. So you're working on ABA techniques, for example, in public. One example is pivotal response therapy, where you're out in public and you put children in situations where they're going to encounter some sort of whatever's related to their goal. It might be asking somebody a question or responding to somebody who's asked them a question, maybe staying on topic with that person, finding some sort of joint interest. So in real settings, you put them in these situations. They're called sort of pivotal moments, essentially. And then you use that to practice them. You don't practice the same thing over and over and over again. You practice the same thing over and over again in the same setting. You practice it over and over again in different types of settings. One of the cool things about this, again, is it's sort of integrated these two early approaches. And the other thing about it is that it really involves, it doesn't just involve the therapist, it involves the parents in this. And I'm just going to skip ahead for a second and tell you that the biggest predictor of response in therapy, any sort of therapy, is the involvement of the parents. The more the parents are involved, the more benefits you're going to see for the child inside of the setting, outside of the setting. But also, it reduces the stress of the parents. It actually gives them tools to be able to work with their child outside of the therapy session. And just a little side note here, siblings are actually really important too if you can involve siblings in the different types of therapy. Siblings are actually better therapists than parents. Parents tend to do everything they can, go out of their way for their child, structure things for the child. Siblings don't do that. And of course it's good to structure things for your child, but it's also good to sort of let your child do their own thing. And siblings do that. And it allows for more chances for growth. So having both the parent and the sibling involved in the therapy, if possible, has benefits both for the child and for the sibling. Again, I talked to you a little bit about the pioneers and these newer hybrids that are available. All of these approaches have empirical support, have at least a decade or so of empirical support in terms of working. Greenspan technique, again, not as much empirical support. However, the approach has been modified in ways that can be integrated with ABA and ABA type therapy and have and it has more empirical support, research support. The last thing I want to put up here is as the children get older, they become adolescents and adults, and they have more language and communication abilities, but they're working on, how to make friends, for example, how to engage with somebody, stay on topic, have the same shared interests. There are individual social skills training sessions that you can get involved with, and there are also social skills groups where you work with a group of individuals, peers with autism spectrum disorders, or maybe autism spectrum disorder, or maybe a mixed group with some peers with autism and some peers without autism. That allows you to practice these back and forth skills. And as you get older, again, these aren't as available, it's really unfortunate, but these things do help translate skills that you've learned maybe in ABA sessions or other sessions into more realistic type settings. So the theme I want you to take away from this, again, all of these psychological approaches that have research support are things that are targeting changing behavior, learning skills, rather than ABA. Some people have said ABA cures autism. ABA doesn't cure autism. It gives individuals with autism the skills that they need to be able to navigate a world. It doesn't change who they are. I know a lot of individuals who have an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis that absolutely would not want to change. They're wonderful, wonderful people. But what we're doing is we're providing them skills so that other people can appreciate how wonderful their skills are. Now, I've already talked about parent involvement. I'll skip here towards educational approaches. Now, of course, the problem with educational approaches is that there's never enough funding to provide the amount of services that children with autism spectrum disorder need. So what you usually need to do is supplement these approaches outside of school, and that's where things get expensive. However, we know that especially speech therapy, if the child has fine motor skills issues, physical therapy can help. We know that different types of occupational therapy approaches are really important for individuals with ASD who are trying to transition, for example, from school to work. There'll be a transition plan. And occupational therapists are really important for developing the adaptive skills to be able to translate what they've learned into a job setting, for example. But all of these different approaches within a school, there are different approaches that are used, and it's hard to go through all of them. They're all important, and as much as you can get from the school, the better. The more you can get from the school, the better, essentially, with these approaches. Especially with things like speech therapy, because social interaction and communication is so important for individuals with autism. Now, you heard me talk a little bit about some different types of classrooms. Now, there's some differing opinion on whether individuals with autism should be fully included in classrooms or should have separate classrooms. And again, that's something that's going to vary based on the individual. It depends on what skills you're going to work with. I don't believe that every child should be fully included in regular education. I don't believe that essentially you want to include the child as much as possible without losing opportunities to work on specific skills. For those children that need a more restrictive environment, that have greater social and communication challenges, there's a couple of really neat classroom models, in particular the TEACH model. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can look up TEACH, T-E-A-C-C-H, at University of North Carolina, that provides entire manuals of how to structure a class to work with children with autism. It works around schedules and visual aids, and it's a whole system designed to help children with autism to minimize all of the other things that they struggle with, so that they can engage in a learning setting. So you can try out some of these different approaches like EVA and other types of learning approaches. But the idea is that it's a structure of the classroom that's specifically created for children with autism that can actually help them within the classroom environment. And again, there are lots of resources available on how to implement that. There are trainings. People travel around the country doing trainings on how to structure a classroom in this sort of way. Now, one thing that does get a lot of publicity is music therapy. And the research sort of shows this as not an empirically supported treatment for autism, but an emerging practice. So it's something that anecdotally people have started to use with individuals with autism and have reported gains. But music therapy could be a million different things. It could be singing a song individually, you could be singing songs as part of a group, you could be using it to build social skills, or maybe not using it to build social skills. So there's not a lot of cohesion as to what music therapy is. However, it does seem that individuals with autism respond, some, not all, but some individuals with autism respond differently to music than they do to social type interactions. So I think it does show some promise, but again, it's something that we don't know enough about yet. And I think it's a tragedy that we don't know enough about music therapy yet. Another approach that you might hear about within the school setting is sensory integration therapy. And here's what I can tell you about autism. It's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but a number of children with autism have different ways of processing sensory information. They can be oversensitive to sensory information. They can be undersensitive. It can be different from child to child. It can be oversensitive to sound. It can be oversensitive to touch, to lights. So we know that some, but not all children on the spectrum, process sensory information differently. There's a theory that one of the problems in autism is integrating the senses together. It's not something that's proven, but it's a theory that sensory integration is a problem in autism. And so there have been treatments designed to target specifically integrating the senses. But the problem is that the theory itself hasn't necessarily been proven yet. However, we know that some of the techniques that are used within sensory integration therapy can minimally help soothing children who have high anxiety. Things like brushing. Things that would be useful for us, that if you've ever been brushed before, it's really nice. It's really good. But it's not, it shouldn't be a primary treatment for autism. Autism isn't overall a deficit in sensory integration. We know there are sensory difficulties for some children. So we know if children are having sensory differences, then you should target whatever it is that they're having trouble with in terms of sensory perception. So again, it's an approach that could be useful, but there hasn't been enough research on it. Now, you always hope. There's always the hope that you could take a pill and it would cure something. And again, this model of curing, you've heard me say, isn't necessarily what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about medications, we're not talking about something, it's even hard to fathom the idea of a pill that would improve social interaction. Social interaction is something you learn. It's not something that's turned on or off. It involves skills. So a pill that could cure social interaction difficulties doesn't quite make sense. However, there's a possibility that some of the associated symptoms with autism, irritability, self-injury, anxiety, problems with attention, could be helped through medication. So again, not targeting a cure for autism, but targeting behaviors associated with autism. That's where medication could have potential. Now, you think there would be more medications right now, but there are only 2 medications that are FDA approved for the treatment of symptoms associated with autism. Again, neither of these are directly affecting the social and communication in autism, but they're targeting things like aggression, self-injury, those sorts of things. Again, only 2. Now, I'm sure we have some parents in the audience, and I bet you if we put a list of all of the different medications that children have been on, I bet you we'd have a list of 40 or 50, minimally, just within this room. What that means, it doesn't mean that your doctors are terrible for giving you these medications. It's just we only have 2 that are proven to work with children with autism. And a lot of medications are used off-label. Anxiety medications to help with anxiety. If the child seems depressed and they're older, depression medications to help with depression. But it's hard enough to do research on medication with children, but a special population like autism, it's even harder to do those kinds of approaches, or to do that kind of research. Just not a lot of research on that. So when you're considering medications for autism, I think it's important to consider them again as a secondary approach. Because they're just essentially probably going to target symptoms. And there's no guarantee that individuals with autism are going to respond to these medications the same way that individuals with other diagnoses or without autism are going to respond that way. Good example are ADHD medications. Some individuals with autism actually, it increases their inattention, can affect their ability, or can make them more aggressive, can bring on tics. Not all individuals with autism, but individuals with autism seem to be more susceptible to those sorts of side effects. So again, you're targeting behaviors with the medication, but there are only 2 that we really know that help with specific behaviors related to autism. Now, you may or may not have heard of different types of experimental medications that sound exciting, things like oxytocin. There's some work done right now at Indiana University looking at memetine, which was used for Alzheimer's in the past. But really exciting, get a lot of press. There's some really interesting preliminary data on these different approaches, but there's not enough yet. So if you're taking these medications, or if you're participating in studies involving these medications, they're promising, but there's not. We tend to set a high standard for things that we think can help with these different things. Again, I'm very skeptical about anything that's going to increase social interactions, because I just don't see social interactions as working that way. But it's possible. It just needs to be more research support for it. I'm going to go through a couple of complementary alternative treatments that are almost as commonly used, if not more commonly used, than some of the treatments that we talked about with research support. The thing that I'm going to say is that for those of you who are considering complementary and alternative approaches with limited resources, they should never be a primary treatment. They should always be an associated treatment if you're going to consider them. You should always start first with things that have research support, like behavior therapy, social skills therapy, those sorts of things. And you can try the complementary and alternative approaches. But again, the things I'm going to talk about here either have been proven not to work or have no research support to date that shows that they work. And again, the thing that you need to be careful with is that people are going to try, if you're a parent, people are going to try to take advantage of your desire to help your child. The best advice that I can give you, if you're looking for information on autism online, the first thing that you should check, there's actually a study on this, looking at which websites provide you true information and false information. And the biggest predictor of whether or not the information on the website was proven or not was whether or not that website was trying to sell you a product. So whenever you're getting information on autism, autism treatments, autism causes, the first thing that you should look at, is this website trying to sell me something? And that's where you're going to be able to, that's going to be your first line of defense about whether people are trying to, it doesn't mean that everybody who's trying to sell you something is bad, but you should automatically be skeptical if the website is promoting something that says that they're trying to sell you some sort of product. And that doesn't mean everybody, again, that doesn't mean everybody who's trying to sell you a product is necessarily bad or has bad intentions, but you should be even more skeptical of this type of information. Now, diets are really popular right now, especially in our area. I don't know if they're as popular here. And we know some children have allergies to different things like gluten and casein. In terms of treating, if you have a true gluten or casein allergy, it helps with symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily help with autism. There have been a number of studies where kids are given cookies that are identical, other than one has gluten in it, one doesn't. There are different types of food that you can have these types of challenges, and there's really been no difference for the treatment of behaviors, or whether the behaviors and social interactions in autism will improve. Same thing with different types of hormone studies, different types of supplemental studies. Again, you can try these things with your child. I never advocate for them, but I say if you're going to do them, you should do them under the supervision of your pediatrician, and you should go into these approaches skeptical. The only approach that I absolutely argue against is chelation. This approach is sometimes used to remove heavy metals from the body. It can be dangerous. When I was at Yale, we knew 3 children who had died from this approach. There's no research support for this type of approach, and it can be a miserable experience for the child. It's not a healthy approach, and I absolutely would not recommend that type of approach. Again, there's so many different approaches out there, and it's really hard to sort through these things. But your red flag should be, when you're looking through information, are they selling you something? You should check who did the research. If they say that there's research, was it the company that did the research? Was it somebody that they hired that's a company that did the research? Or were there independent researchers at a university who did the research for them? And another red flag, again, if it's something that's saying it's a cure for autism, it should automatically raise a red flag for you. Because again, there aren't cures for autism, partly because it's not under the model of a disease that can be cured. We're talking about behaviors when we talk about autism. Now, I guess we have about 10 minutes left. I didn't know if we wanted to do a few questions here. Maybe I could start talking about some of the things that we're doing with our research. Any questions before I move on to this? I see we have about 10 minutes left. Yes? I'm sorry, what's your name?
My name is Phyllis.
Phyllis, hi.
Hi. I know there's talk about environmental, probabilities and that kind of thing. Is there any noted clustering of autism cases, or is it just randomly all over the?
Well, I can tell you that there are a number of known pathways to autism. So, for example, if you have a certain chromosome deletion, I could tell you it's chromosome 22, 11.2, Q, I mean, it's long names, but if you have these certain chromosomal abnormalities or deletions, that you could be more likely to develop autism. There are certain exposures to things in the environment that can lead to an increase of risk of developing autism. But even with the genes, even with exposure to things in the environment, it just increases your risk. It's not necessarily going to say that you definitely have autism. One of the known environmental risks are valproic acid, which is an anti-seizure medication, the rubella virus, the misoprostol, which is a medical type abortion medication, and there's one more that I'm forgetting. I'll think of it in a second. But the idea with all of these is that it's not just that you would be exposed to it at any time, but you would be exposed to it in the first trimester of pregnancy. So it's not like the child is exposed to it and then they develop autism. It's really early in development. Something that affects the brain, like things would affect the brain in autism, is going to happen really early on. So there are some things that can increase your risk of developing autism, but with anything, there's not a single cause of autism.
So you don't see clusters like in Darien or any other town or geographical
You
area?
absolutely see clusters, but it's not for the reason that you think. You see clusters based on where the good services are. So it's really actually hard to study this, because we have families that will move out to California, that will move to Eton and Princeton, where these are families that will do anything for their children, and the clusters are based on where the services are. So, other questions? Yes?
I have a 10-year-old grandson who has Autism. And straight A's, and it's social skills, so we think, look it up, talk to us, she makes him order at the restaurant, whatever. But he has an iPad, and never has to that. How is that?
Well, the cool thing about that is that's actually, it's frustrating and cool, okay? It's frustrating because you don't want the kid using the iPad all the time. You want the child interacting with other people. But right now, within our lab, and I know there are a number of other labs, are working on ways to use the iPad to build social skills, either through building programs or developing, ABA therapy type programs that involve the iPad, that builds off the intrinsic interests of the child. You don't want to take away something that the child loves. What we want to do is try to figure out a way to use something that they love to help them improve. Right. With that in mind, I want to tell you a little bit about something that we're doing that's sort of in the same ilk. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you a media report about something about our research, and I want you to tell me to stop it once you hear something that I absolutely don't agree with. So listen carefully.
Okay. Well, in other news, if you think robots are far-fetched, futuristic machines, think again. The seemingly cold creations are being used in creative new ways to help kids with autism. And and the emotional connection that follows is making a big impact. NBC's Vince Slumsky reports.
It may be a state-of-the-art robot like this guy that helps cure autism.
There you are. So when things get publicity, you can't always necessarily control what's said about them. Obviously, we are developing something that cures autism. We're helping individuals with autism develop skills. Now, why in the world would we want to do robots? We don't want children with autism to interact with robots. We want children with autism to interact with humans. Now, there's a potential, though, with robots to serve as sort of a bridge to social communication, if the robots have enough skills, right? So we know children with autism are really good at understanding patterns, the physical world, things that are consistent, and have trouble with the more unpredictable social world. We know that they're more responsive to any sort of feedback. You remember we talked about reinforcement, any sort of feedback that comes from computers, from iPads, from any sort of technology, over types of social feedback. So you can see how there's potential there for these different types of therapies. And the question is there something about a robot that could maybe simplify and mimic human-type interactions that you could use it within some of these sessions, social skills sessions, even maybe simply as reinforcement to help build these social skills?
Do you think there would be less anxieties and stress in the child?
Theoretically, right? Because if the child, I mean, not all children are anxious in social interactions, but some children with autism are very anxious about social interactions. So this might help you practice these skills in a situation that's not as anxiety-provoking. It might actually be exciting. And maybe you can start to learn the value and the fun part of social interactions. The thing about social interactions is, you know, for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us, it's fun. It's fun to talk to people. It's fun to learn about other people's interests. It's fun to find somebody who loves the movie Transformers, like I love the movie Transformers. You know, and you find these things that you can bond over. And the hope is that you can use this as a modality to make these sorts of connections. And so what we're doing is we're integrating this interactive robot into ABA type or social skills therapies. And what we're doing is we're trying to use it to help the child practice skills, to provide reinforcement for them. Sometimes the robot makes mistakes and the child corrects the robot when they make social errors. But you can see a lot of ways that you could use it to develop these types of interactions. Again, we haven't developed a robot for sale. We aren't trying to sell anything. We're testing an existing robot to see if it benefits therapy. We have we never have any plans on making profits off of the robot. Everything that we do, we make freely available. We're offering to a number of nonprofit centers. So you guys want to meet our robot? I don't know if she was busy earlier this morning working with a child, so we'll see if they're done yet. We'll see if we can get her here. Hey, Kelly, is that you?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well. How are you doing?
Great.
So what did you do? What did you do? Oh, sorry. What did you say? I cut you off. Say that again, please.
How about you?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks. Hey, what did you do yesterday?
Last night I watched a movie with Kyle.
Brian's our other robot. Sounds like a date to me. Was it a date?
Oh yeah.
Really? I thought you guys were just friends.
Well, no, Josh, we are dating.
See, nobody tells me anything about these sorts of things. Now, does anybody have a question for Kelly? Any question? Kelly, Professor Danis asked whether you like NASCAR.
I can't get into it.
You can't get into it? Yeah. I got to work with her. I'm trying to build my fan club, but she hasn't watched any of these. Other questions for Kelly? Yeah.
Is that an actual robot talking, or is there somebody actually typing in the robot speaking out from a keyboard or so forth?
Do you want me to ask Kelly that? We'll see what she has. Kelly, is that you talking to us, or is somebody just pulling some strings?
Of course, it's me.
Oh, is it? Well, let's see about that. Karen, do you want to come out and say hi to everybody? Karen. Karen's our graduate student. Hi, Karen.
Heidi's here too.
Oh, hi, Heidi.
Hello.
So yes, it's controlled in the other room by a human who's able to mimic these types of social interactions in a simpler sort of way. But you see how quickly this back and forth is. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Bye, Kelly. Karen, are you back? I don't even know if Kelly, are you going back to sleep or?
That's nice.
All right. See you later. But you can see, even over a slow Skype connection, how fast that could be. Now imagine when we're not traveling over this distance, how fast this back and forth could be. And so the idea is, as much as possible, we're trying to mimic the human interactions. You can practice them, you can make mistakes. It's a lot harder to do with somebody that's the kid's age that you have to do a lot of training. This way you can have a therapist doing it and practicing these things in a fun sort of way. So that's really the idea behind it. And I see that oh, that's ESPN. But you can see the idea, and again, here's what we use to control it. It's something that's fully adaptable. Our students who know nothing about computers can use this. Our therapists that are working the programs can actually program it. You can do text-to-speech. You have some pre-defined behaviors that you can do, and it's really easy to use. And this is sort of a picture of the setting. Again, it's not just the robot. You have a therapist in with the child and the robot. It's sort of a three-way interaction, or it's a two-way interaction with the coach or the therapist actually coaching the child in this. Yeah?
Why are you using the robotic voice and not more like an actual voice?
Because I'm a scientist. Now, the idea is that the children with autism, the theory goes, is that they would be more interested in the robotic voice first. Now, this robot can actually do a human voice as well. So one of the things that we're hoping to test in our next round of testing, is there a difference between a human voice and a robotic voice? Does that make a difference? Maybe the younger kids like the robotic voice and the older kids like the human voice. We don't know that. But this platform gives us the opportunity to scaffold those skills. Even if they like the robot voice, you could start with the robot voice and then maybe build it into a human voice. And then maybe theoretically build it into an avatar on a computer as opposed to a robot. And ideally build it towards a more human-type interaction. So the idea is that you could scaffold the skills. But it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but I'd love to know the answer to that. It's an empirical question. Yeah?
Well, some autism as an adult,
Mm-hmm.
do they have successful lives, jobs, marriage, children, all those things?
There hasn't been enough, so I'm going to say yes first. I'm going to say yes first. But I'm going to say there hasn't been enough research on outcomes for individuals with autism past even early adolescence. A lot of focus, the focus has been so much on causes and early intervention. We know early intervention is important. We also know children with autism and adults with autism or older can actually still learn skills. There are these critical periods where our brain is what's called plastic, where it's easier to learn things. My little 2-year-old, he's 3 years old now, he's so old, can pick things up a lot faster than I can pick things up. What's actually interesting, some recent findings on autism is that the brains of individuals with autism tend to stay plastic longer. So even though that critical period is not as intense, there tends to be a longer opportunity to learn skills at that sort of rate. So even though early intervention is important, one of the cool things that we're learning is that you can still get gains much, much later. There are a lot of different outcomes for individuals with autism. A lot of it depends on the challenges that they face, how verbal they are, how much exposure and therapy they've gotten, the resources that are available to them in their community. There are a lot of things that can affect outcomes. I know a lot of individuals on the spectrum who are, professors or computer scientists or a lot of different professions that individuals with autism have. I also know a lot of individuals with autism who are in residential settings as well. And it doesn't mean anything other than that they face they faced greater challenges. And they might have made strides, but you've got to view the strides that an individual makes relative to what their skill set is and what the challenges they're facing are. So there's a lot of variation. But there are a lot of things we can do to help. A lot of things that we can do to help. Yeah.
Have you done, or do you know of anyone that's doing any research on adolescents on the spectrum? What we're finding is we've got a lot of adolescents that all of a sudden a switch goes off and they become aggressive, very difficult to manage at home, those types of things. And it seems to be those adolescents, 16, 17, maybe even up to 20, 22. And then eventually they settle back down and settle into a routine, but it's something about that age group, especially the boys.
A couple of different things that could be playing into that. One thing, for example, that's way underdiagnosed in individuals on the spectrum. In adolescence, there's actually a really high occurrence of depression. Especially as you become more aware of your limitations, it actually can be a huge load on the individual, and they might not be able to express it in that sort of way. Whereas, depression is hard enough to diagnose in people that are more social. Imagine a child that already has flat facial affect and a monotone voice, might not actually interact with you much anyway. They can't communicate their feelings as well. So that's one reason. Another thing that you're dealing with during adolescence are hormones.
Yeah.
And we know that, Professor Davis is the expert on this, but when you're dealing with changes in your body that you can't necessarily, you're going to articulate those in a different way. You're going to articulate those in a different way, and it might be in a form such as aggression or something along those lines. Again, there are multiple things that could explain the behavior, but the thing that I would definitely try to be conscious of when you're working with the individuals are they dealing with feelings of depression or anxiety that maybe they're not able to communicate in the same sort of way.
I've got one more question.
Yes.
Have you had any experience with, and I just heard this the other day, with a thyroid imbalance? I
have heard talk about a thyroid imbalance. Again, there are symptoms that go along with a thyroid imbalance, whether or not you have autism. In terms of that being a primary cause of autism, I haven't seen any support.
No, I'm not saying a cause, but a cause of sometimes that light bulb going off in regards to the aggression. I know thyroid is hormonal, so it's all.
Well, yeah, it's something that you could definitely check for. It's not the first thing that I would use to explain the behavior, but if there are concerns and you can't find an explanation for it, it's definitely something worth getting checked out.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
You was talking earlier about parents moving to find the best. In your opinion, where in the United States is the best place to get an autism kid?
It depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for a diagnosis? Are you looking for a certain type of treatment? It's going to, and it would depend on the child's skill set. So, for example, I know that for example, the UC Santa Barbara area has a wonderful pivotal response training approach. I know that, for example, Princeton, New Jersey has an amazing applied behavior analysis approach. There's so many factors that go into making such a large decision like that, that you really want to do some investigation and thinking and get some consultation as to what would be the best approach for your particular child, and then use that to guide your decision. There's not like a holy grail of autism treatment. There are a number of places that have specialties that could help individuals with autism. There are some states where it's easier to get services, and there are some states where it's harder to get
That's
services.
pretty much what I'm talking about. Around here we don't get a lot of services in certain things.
There are certain states that have mandates, and those mandates can differ from state to state. You can look at different states that might have a mandate for services being covered for autism. There are websites that are dedicated to this that map the services. Your best resource right now, if you're looking for some sort of just general resource right now on services that might be available, on information, is either going to come from the Autism Speaks website, autismspeaks.org, which has amazing resources. Another good site is going to be something like the CDC. The CDC has information on where different services are available as well. So there are places where you can get that information. But again, there's not a single place that I would recommend for all children. Does it make sense?
Where's what would be the best place to get more involved in at least for Ohio as far as
Oh, this is what I just had my class do. I had to look up laws for their specific states. The first place that I would usually go would be the state whatever the .gov website is for Ohio. They should, not all of the state websites are good. I don't know in particular about Ohio's website. That's the first place I would go. Another place that I would look for services is the Neisinger Center. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly right, but it's at Ohio State. I was familiarizing myself with their website, and they have a lot of different services there that maybe you could contact them and they'd be able to help you in terms of at least finding what would be covered in your state and what might not be covered. And if I lived in this area, those would probably be the first two places that I'd go for information about this area. Again, I don't know if there are advocacy groups in Marion. I'm not familiar with that, so there might be. And I would assume that the Neisinger Center would know about that. Yeah?
Has your research found that there's a high increase in vision problems in the autistic spectrum people?
When you say vision problems, do you mean having trouble seeing or having trouble understanding what you see?
The actual visual distortion.
I haven't seen that. I know children with autism tend to process, not all children with autism, but a lot of children with autism tend to process visual information differently. For example, when I look at this right here, I see a big window, right? Individuals with autism are more likely to see a bunch of little windows. It's like seeing the trees as opposed to seeing the forest. There's a lot of research that shows that there's sort of this different way of processing visual information. I haven't seen anything in terms of specifically related to vision that would be any different from another developmental disability. I think in general it tends to be more common in developmental disabilities, but I haven't seen anything specific to
The
autism.
reason I asked is Asperger's family member, 9 years old, and just discovered that he actually sees upside down.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. So again, that's a wonderful example of individuals that are struggling with social interactions are going to have different barriers to social interactions. Some of them could be medical, some of them could be neurological, some of them, there are lots of different things that could play into these. So again, it's important to pay attention to the individual when you're looking at how to provide them with services. Interesting. I'm assuming he's seen a neurologist?
He's seen many.
Good. Oh, I'm sure he's seen a ton.
They've given him a prescription lens that has corrected it.
So minimally, as long as he's had, they should give him an MRI if he hasn't already had an MRI to be able to look for things like, for example, tumors, or there are a lot of things that could show up that could affect vision in that sort of way. There might be abnormalities that are present from birth, or there could be other things that could affect vision. So, yeah.
Is there any indication of immune system problems where they're developing more, they're susceptible to more colds and flus and different things other than other children?
It's very controversial. There's a lot of research that's going on in that right now. And I could, a lot of it has come out of the idea related to vaccines, that there might be some sort of immune differences in children with autism. Again, in my personal reading of the literature, I haven't seen that. I know that there's a lot of research going on that right now. A lot of research happening, especially through Autism Speaks. It's one of the things that's been one of the Autism Speaks goals, is to fund research that's looking into that. Yeah?
I'm a parent of 2 boys on the spectrum, a 17-year-old with Asperger's and a 13-year-old with autism. And I commented on the question, my comment is the medications are so tricky. We've tried both girlfriends and they use it.
Right. So you notice for both of those, I said some and not all. Again, there's not a magic pill that's going to help all children with autism. And the thing about Risperdal too, that I didn't say, but I'll just go ahead and say it now, that you get tolerant of Risperdal really quickly. So even if you're responding to Risperdal, you're not going to respond to it forever. It's sort of a stopgap. And there's no replacement for Risperdal once you're tolerant to Risperdal. And there are a lot of side effects to it. So absolutely, absolutely.
And then my question, you don't seem at all concerned about just this one diagnosis of autism. I never even heard of autism, and I've been around autism a while, so I haven't heard of that one. But I'm most concerned about my child with Asperger's, because he is very bright in school and all that. It's definitely the social, and I'm worried some of our children won't get services.
I'm teaching an entire class on the very subjects, and I think that it's complicated on multiple levels. Like I said, so there's the idea that individuals with Asperger's syndrome do fit on this spectrum. So that's one thing that we know. So there's nothing necessarily categorically different about Asperger's syndrome, but it's not that easy. There's a whole culture around the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. There are websites and communities, so there are social implications of changing this diagnosis. There's also the issue that the new autism spectrum disorder diagnosis requires that you have some sort of repetitive behaviors or stereotype interests. So if you have a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, and as long as you have some sort of repetitive behavior or stereotype interest, you're still going to meet that criteria. It's the children that have social and communication deficits, that don't have specific interests or repetitive behaviors that aren't necessarily going to meet that diagnosis. There's good news and bad news to that. The good news is that there's another diagnosis. For men, another diagnosis. That's called social communication disorder. And the idea is that people who don't have these repetitive behaviors supposedly don't fit this autism model, right? The bad news is that that doesn't fall under the autism mandates. So if you had autism mandates for services, you might not get the same services. So there is some concern about that. Again, that's mostly going to affect individuals who have social and communication difficulties, but don't have really stereotype-specific interests or repetitive behaviors. From the research that I've seen, I know that there was a New York Times article that said there was going to be a 50% reduction. That only looked at really, really high-functioning individuals with autism. So across the whole spectrum, it looks like about a 2% reduction in people who are going to be diagnosed. But it is a reduction. It does look like it's going to be a fewer number of children meeting the diagnostic criteria. I share your concern. I share your concern. I didn't see who was first. You didn't.
Out of the educational therapies that you talked about or strategies, when ABA isn't working, what would you say is the next step to try? I have a student, I'm a teacher of students with autism. We have a student, she has 0 motivators whatsoever. We've tried, objects that she's picked up, let her explore and find something.
She's non-verbal?
Correct.
Yeah. Has she had genetic testing done before for something like Rett syndrome, for example?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Because sometimes Rett syndrome only occurs in girls and is often diagnosed as part of the autism spectrum and has sort of different prescribed treatment.
She was verbal and she had an overdose of medication a few years ago, and after the overdose she lost her verbal communication.
Now, did she have the autism diagnosis before?
Yeah.
Okay.
But like when we let her explore the room, if she finds something, she'll pick it up and she'll play with it for a little bit. So we'll think, okay, that'll motivate her. So we'll try to work with her and we'll take that away and use that to give back to her. And if we take it away, her hands go on her head and she just shuts down. That's it.
Does she have any hand movements that she does?
She did sign language, but that was kind of one of the ones, she was picking up sign language and that was one of the ones that has stopped this
What about
year.
repetitive hand movements?
No, she stems a lot on
Clinical
toys.
diagnosis. Sorry,
Oh,
I'm
you're
trying to
fine,
take
you're
down
fine.
something.
If you want to get to other questions, I have no problem sticking around talking to you afterwards if you have more questions about her. She stems a lot, but as far as repetitive behaviors, no, she doesn't really flap or tap or anything like
Does she do
that.
anything with her hands like this?
She just stems a lot with, she has to have something in between. She won't do hand to hand, but she'll have something in between and she'll stem both of her hands on something.
It might be worthwhile having her get some genetic testing. But at the same time, it's hard to say without seeing the kid, like
Right.
a replacement sort of thing. Minimally, I know that there are a lot of kids that are in ABA for a long time and don't respond, and then at some point something clicks.
Well, and she's 14 and she started her menstrual cycle this year, so we've had this
So that also
issue
might
with
be a
hormones
fact. Yeah.
come up too, and so I know that.
But there's a good thing with that. There's a second burst of plasticity in the brain around puberty, in all of us. So you actually can learn a lot during adolescence as well. So it's frustrating, but it's also opportune time neurologically. So I wish I had a better answer.
That's okay.
So, yeah. And then
You hear a lot about rates of autism right now. Are there really more individuals with autism standing than there were in 2022, or is it just being diagnosed?
Well, there are definitely more people being diagnosed with autism. Here are the things we know for certain. We know the diagnostic criteria that we used in 1987 were like this. And if you look at the diagnostic criteria we used in 1994, they were like this. If you look at the diagnostic criteria that we use right now, if I had slides that showed you the changes in the diagnostic criteria, the current diagnostic criteria, by comparison, would start here and end over at that wall. So we've pitched a big tent right now. We're making that tent a little bit smaller with the new diagnosis. Again, it's diagnosed based on behavior. It's a hard thing to diagnose in children that are sort of on the borderlands of the diagnosis. So we know, one, part of the increase is due to these expanding definitions. We know that's true. We know part of the reason of the expanding definitions is increased knowledge of it. We know doctors know more about it. We know doctors in small towns, in lower SES communities are diagnosing autism more. We know that families know more about it and are more likely to bring it up to their pediatrician. So we know definitely that those things are affecting the prevalence rates. We also know that the prevalence rates now include autism, Asperger's, and PDD, whereas the prevalence rates before were just autism. There weren't all these other diagnoses. Whether or not in addition to that, whether or not there's an increase overall in diagnosis, I don't know. But I can say that a lot of the explanation of the changes has to do with how we're defining autism. It doesn't mean there isn't an increase, but the dramatic changes that we're seeing right now are related to this. Somebody? Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm a speech therapist, and
Yes.
I have,
Oh, one of the front line.
well, I'm hoping to be, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I have 4 autistic children in our public school now, and I know another preschooler coming in next year. What kind of initial therapies do you recommend, especially for nonverbal children, which our 2 preschoolers are?
Well, whatever their goals are in your IEP, you're going to target the specific skills that are at the top of their list. Again, it's going to be based on the individuals. What skills do they have? What behaviors are interfering with skill development? For example, if there's self-injurious behavior, that's one of the first things that you want to get rid of. The next thing is how many words do they have? Do you want to get them to start learning words? Do you want them to use functional phrases? Some kids have functional phrases, some kids don't. So if they don't have functional phrases, like asking to go to the bathroom or saying you're hungry or things like that. I mean, there are a lot of the things that you do naturally with you do naturally as a speech and language, a speech and language pathologist, speech and language therapist. You know, you really want to focus on the child. You know, there's this tendency to think about maybe autism differently and think about, you know, bigger swaths that might help with children with autism. But again, you want to look at that child's skills, what behaviors might be interfering with their ability to learn, and target those first.
Do you find the use of switches or an iPad program such as Proloquo to Go beneficial, or is that looking down the line?
It depends on the child. I've seen a number of kids use them successfully. Some kids use them less successfully. It's worth trying, I would say, if they're nonverbal. I actually had one child who was nonverbal, who there was a kid sitting next to him using, it was a dynamo or something like that. He never had his own augmentative communication device. That actually went to the other kid and used his dynamo, listened to what the dynamo said, and then said it himself. So he used that as a route for him to learn. Again, it wasn't working for the kid that was using the dynamo, but when the kid was given the opportunity, he sort of sought that out. So it's worthwhile, it's definitely worthwhile to try, I would say, especially for the nonverbal kids. Proloquo is okay. It's not very adaptable, it's got its drawbacks, but it seems like it's the best that's available right now. And you're really going to have to work, one of the problems that we've had with it is, you know, it takes a lot of fine motor skills to work with an iPad screen. So the kids that are going to benefit from that are kids that maybe have fewer motor deficits, at least at this stage, because you're dealing with a pretty small screen that can move around. Yeah. And I think you can lock it. There are things you can do to lock it, but it's something to consider. Yes?
How do you find out the exact amount of funding for your specific child or student that is being given to the school district from the Ohio Department of Education? Because I know it varies per child, but you know, how do you find out exactly what that number is to see if those funds are being used appropriately?
And the school won't give you that information, or you don't trust the school with providing you with that information?
You don't trust the school with providing this kind of information.
Okay, then you're probably going to want, you're either going to want to work with an advocate group. There are advocates that have dealt with issues in law, usually parents that have gone through it, you know, there are lawyers usually involved with that. They're usually parent advocacy groups. You can also go to the state and ask for that information. Again, I'm making sort of the same suggestions that I made before. The state should be able to provide that information for you. If you're concerned, obviously, about not getting the services that you're entitled to, there's obviously, you can go through mediation to get that resolved. But again, you're going to be more prepared for those if you have, if you're working with advocates who have been through that situation before. Yeah.
You could go through the Autism Society in Toledo. That is where we found out for our school district. Each, you know, developmental disability has a different amount. Autism being the highest paid, and I think, if I remember correctly, it was around $28,000 per kid.
Did you say Autism Society?
Yes.
Of Toledo? So there are different chapters of Autism Society? So yeah, they have different chapters. And if you call one, they might refer you to a different one, but they're usually pretty good in terms of providing advocates. Well, before y'all go, just really fast, I want to thank my lab, who has helped us with all of our research. All of the centers that we work with, and a lot of friends that work with the Fun Lab, a couple of enemies down there. We can share our dislike of University of Michigan and any other ones you might see up there. And special thanks to all the children and families who have helped us with our research. See you guys later. It was nice talking to you.